If you know anything about me and what I bring to this channel, you know that one of the areas that I have been most distraught about the damage being done over the past few years is the damage being done to environmental regulations as climate change and other environmental disasters proceed at a terrible pace year by year. But you also know that hypothetically, depending on how the election goes, perhaps there is room for a little bit of positive change in that area. And to speak about all this and more, very excited to welcome to the show the North American Director for 350.org, Tamara Tolles O'Loughlin. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It is nice to have something good to talk about.
It is, and so hopefully we're gonna find a few of those things. So before we launch into some of looking forward to the next months and years, for people who might not be familiar with your organization, can you tell them what it's all about?
Yeah, so 350.org is a global climate organization focused on three things: ending fossil fuels, and the ways that we're doing it constitute the other things that we spend our time doing. So we're interested in making sure not another penny goes to keep the fossil fuel economy going, and that we raise up the voices of those that are most impacted in trying to get this work done. So most recently, we spent a lot of time translating the other climate people that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are in fact climate people as well. So beyond making it really hard to do dirty, oily business and telling climate people to not be racist, we have our hands full.
That either of those seems like a full-time job. So tell me a little bit about that progress, because that sort of criticism that the sorts of voices in climate activism that tend to be raised up tend to look pretty similar. Do you think that there's been much progress over the past few years on that front?
So I do. We're in the middle of the 15th anniversary of Katrina. And it feels like it's not an odd time to raise that was the first time we called the question, if you care about this stuff, how could you let this happen? So that was the first reminder that folks who've been in this work, when it was environmental work, when it was environmental justice work, when it was zoning and air quality and all the things that we like to do to separate it out in the silos, we weren't talking about people and planet. And the reason we weren't doing it is because it's easy to separate the protection of a specific species or sage grouse or grass even, than to try to deal with the stuff we designed to make this work exclusive. And so Katrina raised the alarm, unfortunately, for a lot of people, and then Flint happened, and all the water people felt like, wow, this is what we do. Like protecting people from poison water is an entire specialty in environmental work. And here we let this happen, not somewhere else, not where we could say there's a lot of political cover for it, but right in our own backyard. And so second bell went off, and climate people started to get the point that like these conversations we're having about moving the needle for climate are deeply tied to the stuff we built that makes it harder to do the work. So if you exclude all the people who were harmed, then you probably can't invite them to a conversation about change. If the future of even park space involves having people in it, you should probably have some brown or Black people in that conversation, because in 2040 everyone will be one of them. So it's pretty tough to keep skirting around it, and it feels like we're in a moment where people of color are moving into the places where strategy happens. So not just important visual moments, crying on cue, all the stuff that we used to do when everybody's tagline was save this bear, save this tree, don't touch that grass, murder all these people. So now that we sort of switched our tactics into focusing on the fact that no room of bears, no matter how virtuous, will ever sit around in a room trying to figure out how to save us from climate. So potentially this is a good place to spend our energy.
Yeah. You mentioned it was 15 years ago, and it really, man, it doesn't feel like it was 15 years ago. I still remember exactly where I was when I was watching the initial footage and hearing, the impassioned phone call, I believe, from the mayor at that point. So that was 15 years ago. Just a few years ago, I think 3 years ago, we had hurricanes very close together hit Puerto Rico and Texas. And we had very different responses to those two things. So when you experience that years after Katrina, years in which we should have learned, when you see that, do you have any hope that while Donald Trump is president, that if the same thing were to happen, that we would respond to it in any different way than we did a few years ago?
Wow, I feel like we as human beings might respond to it. I don't know if the guy who lives in public housing at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue would in fact respond any differently, mostly because he's expended all the folks who we put on that job. So under his leadership, FEMA is so overextended that they couldn't respond to a broken window and a cat in a tree at the same time, because they have been put out to do work that could have been stopped by any amount of planning. So FEMA, who did not the greatest job in any of those spaces, isn't even fully equipped to respond in fire and flood season. I mean, we're in the middle of that moment now. Fires are raging as people are being flooded. Puerto Rico is the best case, the most well-known case. The US Virgin Islands of St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John, which are 20 minutes away, have no hope of being seen in this world because it's full of black and brown people who have even less access to voting power in the way that Puerto Rico does. So it definitely isn't a race for how we can measure who's suffering, but we are in a moment where even with the best intentions, we do not have the infrastructure to respond to all of these things happening at once, and that is a failure of government.
Yeah, so starting to look to the future, we don't know exactly how November is going to go, or even if we'll really have an election. But we do have nominees now. So we've got Biden and we've got Kamala Harris. Out of the potential choices, you've had a fairly wide range of environmental policies and platforms represented in this primary. How would you rate how this whole thing ended with those two as our nominees?
Oh gosh, so I would say that it has been a tight race for climate, which isn't a thing we could have predicted. In this election, the power of the movement really got in everyone's faces, from lobbying and bird dogging the DNC to making sure individual plans coming out of it, to making sure that every single candidate had something to say about what they were gonna do on climate, the veracity of those plans, how strong they are, who they help, whether they happen in a reality that we could get anywhere close to is like another set of questions. But in a moment where people at least have to have a stance on climate, it moves it up in the conversation to somewhere closer to being able to mobilize the kind of numbers we would need to see real action that prevents us all from dying on a fiery gas ball. So I would say that all things being equal, the race actually showed up as a great place to wait a conversation, and that was without the climate debate that we needed. That horrifying multi-day, everybody had something to say but never together thing that got done instead was useful for laying out platforms. And for the folks that were ready, they were able to really advance the conversation and put us in a moment where even in all of the cluster that is the Democratic National Committee, we can have a conversation about good platforms versus okay and solid platforms.
Yeah. By the way, I think the tagline for this year is going to be dying on a fiery gas ball.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.